right? I mean, the WCW show, World Championship Wrestling, which eventually morphed into WCW Saturday Night, right?
Yeah.
That was
Well,
a cable
can you,
show. Sure.
JD, can you explain that real quick? Because I just got into an argument with somebody about this on Facebook, and I don't know why I engaged, because I'm above it. Actually, maybe I'm not above it.
Why are you fighting with wrestling fans on Facebook? You're beyond this.
I know. I'm 41 years old. What am I doing? Get a life, Gilbert. But can you just explain what WCW was, and then then exactly what Ted Turner bought and turned it into WCW in 1988?
Okay, so when we say WCW, when we usually we're referring to the promotion of World Championship Wrestling. The World Championship Wrestling name carries over from the television show, which started off as Georgia Championship Wrestling in 1974. That was on WTCG television. Eventually, WTCG becomes WTBS, Turner Broadcasting System, right? And that was Ole's promotion, right? There have been other promotions. Paul Jones had ran stuff, and Ray and Ann Gunkel ran stuff. So there's always TV in Georgia wrestling, but eventually it's Ole's show that becomes that starts as Georgia Championship Wrestling and then becomes World Championship Wrestling. In the late 70s, it becomes the most popular wrestling show on cable, because cable is new and WTBS is a superstation. And there was a handful of what they called superstations in the country that got to get broadcasting cable. We had one in Chicago, WGN. New York had WOR.
LA had KTLA.
KTLA. So we didn't get that in Chicago. So I actually didn't know that until you just said that.
Yeah.
So, but there was a handful of superstations that literally had their stuff broadcast across the country. Now, because of that, the territory system starts to crumble. People blame Vince. In reality, it's Turner that starts the end of the territory system, because so many people were able to watch World Championship Wrestling on TBS, and it changed its name to World Championship because people in Ohio started watching. Specifically, Dayton, Ohio becomes the first place where these start to crack. You know, they have a deal with the Tunnies up in Toronto. All of a sudden, things start to move and start to change. So the show is World Championship Wrestling. Vince, Black Saturday, buys the promotion, buys Georgia Championship Wrestling promotion, and takes, not because he wanted to run those towns, but because he wanted that TBS time slot. So the World Championship Wrestling TV show becomes a WWF TV show in 84. And they actually reverted the name back to Georgia Championship Wrestling, which is interesting. I've always thought that was an interesting move, that it became Georgia Championship Wrestling again, but it had the same exact intro. And then Vince sells that spot back to Crockett, and it becomes once again World Championship Wrestling. Funny part is they had the same exact intro for all three promotions. That famous intro.
Yeah. Did Vince not own the name World Championship Wrestling when he bought the time slot? Did he not own it?
I thought he did.
Because he bought Georgia Championship Wrestling, and I thought he owned. Maybe we'll have to do some research on that. Maybe for like next episode, we'll clarify. I could have swore he owned the name World Championship Wrestling, because Ole Anderson then starts Championship Wrestling from Georgia.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah, very very clever. And then they get on TBS, and then when Vince then sells to Crockett, that's when WCW, the World Championship Wrestling TV show, comes back. And then Crockett's got that show, and then Championship Wrestling from Georgia is still a thing for a little bit.
For just a little bit, then it pretty much gets absorbed into Crockett. Like Crockett bought it, and so what's interesting happening is, like, the show is called Georgia Championship Wrestling, but it still has the World Championship Wrestling intro. Like, it still says World Championship Wrestling on the thing. Weird. So at the time when Vince is on TBS, you also have Ole's shows in the mornings, right? The Championship Wrestling from Georgia. By the way, shitty shows. You also have Watts's UWF Mid-South, is also on TBS at the same time. So TBS has three different wrestling promotions at the same time going. What show won? What show outdrew? Watts is number one. When Vince wanted to get rid of it, Watts thought the spot was his. Crockett snuck it out from underneath him. And then, so that that's that whole thing that brings that into place. So the show continues through, right? Crockett buys the UWF, Mid-South Watts, and that becomes part of it. And then eventually the show, TBS, or Turner, I should say, buys Crockett, not the NWA, but Crockett. Yeah. And originally it was called Universal Wrestling Corporation in 89. They still NWA, we wrestle, and that was the Universal Wrestling Corporation. And then in 1990, they decided to rebrand the company WCW, World Championship Wrestling. They renamed the company, I should say, after the TV show. That is WCW. Yes. So that is the abbreviated history of how we got WCW as a name. What exactly were you fighting about?
I said that TNA lasted outlasted WCW and ECW.
Oh, yeah. 100%.
And I said twice they've lasted twice as long as either one of those companies.
Mm-hmm.
And technically I'm correct because WCW wasn't established until, you can say 1988, but 1990 is like when the LLC WCW was created. Mm-hmm. I didn't say it was on longer than the World Championship Wrestling TV show, because that show was on for 20 years or whatever, 25 years. So on Saturday nights at 6:05, it was on for a long time, right? Mm-hmm. So that was the argument. I was like trying to give the guy a history lesson. He just wasn't having it. And I was like, oh, wait a minute, you're stupid. What am I doing? Why am I talking to this moron about the history of pro wrestling when clearly he has no idea what he's talking about? So mm-hmm. I was trying to be matter of fact to defend my video. But anyway.
But here's the problem with that, and this is where I take up issue with stuff like this, is because WWE has taken control of the wrestling history narrative, and they tell their version of history, and oftentimes like they don't talk about that like they did. I did not see the Black Saturday episode. Did you see the Black Saturday episode?
I did, and I enjoyed it, because that was the first time I had seen Gerald Briscoe kind of talk publicly and honestly about it.
How accurate were they? Like, were they pretty good, or were they giving you a WWE homogenized version of history?
I didn't see any connection to WWE whatsoever on that.
That's good. Okay.
I thought it was pretty good. Did they leave a lot of stuff out? Yeah, I mean, it's a 45-minute show, and it really could have been a 40-hour documentary. Yeah,
for sure. Like I said, Ken Burns' History of Professional Wrestling documentary that exists in one of the alternate universes is a phenomenal thing. Unfortunately, the only guy that can make that documentary is no longer interested in doing those sorts of things.
So, unless you're a billionaire and you want to fit the bill on that one.
Yes. Yeah, I'll do that, by the way. If Tony Khan wants to pay me to do that, I'm more than happy to do that. Like, so that's my qualm, though, is like their version of history often becomes like the version of history. And that bothers me because like you get arguments like this. Like I had an argument with the guy once. He's like, WCW didn't come up till 1990. And I showed him the picture of Vince standing in front of the WCW logo. And he said I created an AI.
Yeah.
I was just like, okay, you're a fucking tool.
Yeah. Like at that point, the conversation just has to end. I was like, okay, you're not a serious person.